But next up, we're going to have Donald Barron, who is he's a lead performance analyst, performance strategy analyst at Loughborough University. Donald has a wealth of experience working at Norwich City in their promotion season back to the Premier League. He's worked at Leicester City, Coventry, in kind of various technical roles. So Donald is going to be speaking to us about blending the art and science of scouting, which very much in the kind of analytics and the data age, that blend of kind of hat and coat scouting and data and knowledge derived from models and metrics, and the melding of the two seem to be kind of where the best recruitment departments can, the ones that are the best get the value out of both of those things. So Donald, give us a shout when you are on, and we can get rolling with you.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the introduction there. It was a great talk from Gareth. I'll just share my screen. Thanks very much for joining us today at PAC20. Obviously, thanks to Tom for those kind words. But what I'll do is obviously say thank you to the staff at SBG for inviting me here today. And my talk, it's going to be slightly different to Gareth's, but it'll be a very quick insider's guide to perspectives on what it's like to work in a Scouting and Recruitment department, but also the role that data and technology play in that process. It's obviously combined with other subjective elements as well. I'm going to cover a few key areas that hopefully spark some more thoughts, discussions, conversations after the event, and obviously hopefully provide you some new insights into what it's actually like to work inside a Scouting and Recruitment department in the Premier League. So I'll talk and give you a quick overview of my career path, my background in professional football, and at some point later on I'll talk about my new role. But what I'll do is I'll give you a slight overview, because I understand there's different audiences for the event today. A bit of a background about scouting, professional football and data, and the kind of progression there's been over the last 20 or 30 years. And I'll try and introduce you some of the sort of processes and solutions to the challenges that are involved in scouting players. So just moving into my background, I've obviously, everything I talk about today is going to be based on, my perspective and reflections on my career, being involved in football for about 15 years. But that background, I wasn't a player or a coach. So my background and my kind of reflections come probably from a more kind of academic, educational entry into the sport. So that's slightly different. But I spent over 10 years in professional football, like Tom said, working at Leicester City, Coventry, Norwich City. I was the head of performance analysis at each of those clubs for over 10 years. I was really lucky to work with some exceptional people. And I think the sport of football, every environment is unique, but football is very much a mix of expert knowledge. And then there's been this tremendous change in terms of technology and data, which I think has added a lot. And it's helped as the sport has grown and the investment has grown in the sport. But I've also completed an MPhil and published articles in machine learning and artificial neural networks, and using them to analyze player performance for Scouting and Recruitment. What I would say is I'm not a data scientist. I think I've got a general broad skill set, but I was very much a link between a lot of different departments and trying to develop processes to make us more effective and efficient. My last role in professional football was very much focused on Scouting and Recruitment. I was head of technical scouting at Norwich City, and that role was very much around linking and organising the kind of more art subjective elements, and combining those with the more detailed data science technical processes for identifying and monitoring players. So just to give you a bit of a background to understand a little bit what I'll discuss later, because of the unique mix of individuals involved, I'll give you a quick overview of what I see as kind of some key moments for the last 20 or 30 years, because we've experienced an incredible change in the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact. I think today is a real prime example of that. But the Premier League, which is kind of the era I probably attach and engage with, sort of growing up, the early 90s, the Premier League, obviously only 13 foreign players in that first round of fixtures. There was heavy restrictions on the number of foreign players you could actually field in European football. In the mid-90s, there was this huge change, Jean-Marc Bosman ruling. It's held up as a key moment, but obviously it's just part of a wider context of kind of globalization. But we had this period of probably success and dominance for Manchester United that transitioned into, being challenged in the early 21st century by the Abramovich era at Chelsea. Transfer windows were introduced, were hugely important. So it's obviously less than 20 years since they were introduced, but we've now moved into very much an era of global owners, billionaire owners being the norm, but clubs being part of almost a family of sporting organizations or companies, or a network of clubs around the world. So in terms of an actual data and technology, and the reason I bring this up is because different people have got a different knowledge and expertise in some of these areas, but we've moved very much from a kind of pen and paper analog era into the digital area, or digital era, sorry, full of cloud opportunities. We've got high processing power, home computers, the broadband, or the introduction of broadband, and highly shareable, high quality video and data. We can now analyze sporting events live in terms of tracking and on the ball data in extreme detail. And we've moved from an era probably of a lot of data collection and interaction without real clear understanding or being able to analyze it in detail into this era now of more advanced analysis and actual insights through artificial intelligence. So in terms of the importance of this, I think it's that there's a number of people who maybe in the early periods of the Premier League era and through that, who are maybe in their teens or 20s, 30s, 40s, they're the key decision makers in the sporting environment and in elite football. But they've all got unique experiences, knowledge, expertise, and perceptions of some of these changes. And that's very, very important in the scouting and recruitment field. So what this means in general for scouting and recruitment, those of you not familiar with the football environment or the scouting world, I like to compare it to climbing a mountain, and very much one of the biggest challenges out there, Mount Everest. So to climb something like Everest safely, it involves a huge amount of planning, preparation that can take months or years that you don't see. You only really see the end part of the process. But there's a very clear end point or summit to reach when you're climbing something like Everest, but it involves a huge amount of inherent dangers due to the numerous unpredictable factors that go into it. There's a lot of things that are out of your control. There's also numerous periods, or there's a critical period of time to complete that ascent. So they call it the death zone, because you can only live at that peak period for so long. Now, this might sound very dramatic, or you might not see the link at the moment, but there's numerous ways to identify and recruit players. There's a huge amount of work that goes into that decision. But there's also people that have been carrying out these roles for decades, successfully to a point as well, that have not had the access to technology and modern data and technology that we have now. People like Tenzin Norgay and Edmund Hillary, reached that summit of Everest in 1953. There are equivalent people in professional football. And I think that's something that you need to understand, and to actually be able to engage with those people to be successful. But the context, I think the unpredictable nature of the conditions, the pressure, the expectations, all those emotions and the stress and fatigue actually getting to that summit, they are replicated in professional football. So we obviously have deadline day that's very media and entertainment driven, but there is a long process of days, months, years involved in transfers. But there's a huge amount of pressure internally in organizations, externally from the media, from fans, and there's a huge amount of fatigue because transfers tend to go very late to deadline day because of the number of people involved. And what happens is, under those extreme pressures, that extreme almost like death zone area, some decisions, very costly decisions, can be made under those extreme pressures. So in terms of actually looking at the process and how you mitigate these risks, you want to try and make informed decisions. That was what my role was about, was to try and add more objectivity and more of a structure and a process to this. So you want to fend off those last minute decisions. So I always looked at developing the most effective processes. And to think of it simply, it's a kind of through stages of plan, do, review, and it's a constant ongoing cycle. It involves a lot of different elements, but the most important part for me was starting with the end in mind, or having a real clarity of purpose. And that sounds very simple. It's something that's talked about a lot, but in a football environment, there's a lot of different stakeholders, but there is very much a death zone in terms of hierarchies in professional football as well. The higher the organization you reach, the more likely that you are going to leave that organization fairly in the sort of short to medium term. So a lot of people, the higher they reach, the shorter their lifespan tends to be in the organization. So getting clarity on purpose can be very challenging. But I was very much someone who focused on listening, trying to engage with individuals, asking questions about what their ideal team was, their ideal playing philosophy or strategy, the ideal players per position, and trying to engage and listen and tease out information of the types of players they liked and how they wanted to play and what the end goal was. So once I had a picture of this, I try and create clear visuals through video, through data, visualizations, charts, and also, easy to understand descriptions and profiles of players that we could align across our data profiles, our scouting reports, and try and quantify and assess the real important performance questions we had about players to monitor them and track them. So some of that involved a real clear squad management succession planning process that incorporated the first team and academy players. And we're looking to project forward and take into account things like the progress reports we're receiving on the kind of holistic approach on all the players, looking at the age profile, the contract expiries, the experience levels, or the minutes being played, or the contributions being made by certain individuals, and looking at that over multiple seasons or multiple transfer windows, because they were a real key, kind of review point or progress point. But to actually identify or monitor our own players and then compare them to others to progress our squad, we used a sort of variety of tools and resources. So looking at the more subjective scouting side of things, we had very clear and specific scouting reports per position on a system ISF from Scout 7, or what was Scout 7. But that process obviously had subjective elements, but also some objective scoring. And we tried to put a lot of time and effort into getting some consistency among scouts and them to understand what we wanted. But what we would do to try and take it to another level was we'd actually extract through the API in a JSON file some of the subjective key markers and words and terminology we asked them to include in scouting reports. We'd also take their scoring systems they had for different elements of the performance, and we'd also look to take some scoring systems on the actual recommendations they made, and then actually take that into our bespoke online apps that we'd created. So we understood that the scouts, there was some variety, they had different tendencies, some would score higher or lower. So we try and adjust and weight for the level of competition, but also the actual scout who'd filed a report to try and get some sort of accurate assessment of where they were progressing to based on the subjective elements. But what we'd do is we'd combine this with more objective data analysis of players. So we had a really club-specific, position-specific rating system that analysed elements, the same elements we looked at in the scouting report, so the physical performance, technical, tactical, decision-making, and the kind of position-specific profile elements. So a lot of this, obviously, when I was involved ball contact data, which has some certain limitations. There were some elements of physical data that came in later, but we had these rankings for a number of competitions around Europe for different age groups, and we were able to obviously assess based on the competition they were in, the country, but also compare our own players to them. And this was really helpful, and we could have some really simple visuals, radar charts, almost formations of the pitch of the top players by leagues, competitions, certain age groups to discuss with the coaches, staff and the manager, so they could sort of understand why certain players were being flagged or monitored or scouted. This obviously had limits though, because we only had data for certain countries, and we're actually, it's a very global sort of sport. We're looking all around the world. But we'd also, to look more on a sort of long-term basis, we're trying to look at, well, which players outside of that remit can we assess, but also how do players' careers progress? So for us, we were wanting to try and get players that we knew had some element of progression within their career, some value. So we had almost a career experience system, a model that took into account the appearances being made by the players, the competition, the sort of UEFA coefficient of that league, and the results while they were performing. So we could actually monitor and track the progression of careers for players over several decades. And that could give us a model of what was a typical Champions League level player, a top 5 level player, and so on and so forth. So we could see outliers or people who are ahead of curves. We could also get flags of players appearing below certain ages and starting to make a significant number of appearances, which was something we were very focused on. So we also ran projects on the common movement patterns of players, because we're obviously looking around Europe. There's something to understand is that you can't just scout or sign any player you want. There's certain patterns of players moving between certain quality of clubs or certain competitions at either certain stages or for certain values. And we had to understand what was realistic for us, because we didn't have the money to sign all the top players like a Sadio Mane, etc. We had to identify the players that were the right value and right quality for us, but also had potential for a future resale. And we used all that content to try and make our scouting as efficient as possible. So there's certain logistical challenges because games are going on constantly, but there's only so many weeks and months between each transfer window. So we had scouts in situ in certain countries, and we had full-time staff who were based at the training ground. But we were trying to be as efficient as possible with our selection of games and the age profile, the quality of players, and the positions of the players that we're looking at. And all of these things we were trying to hit certain targets, and we'd set objectives around having knowledge and understanding of the real key players at the right age profile, the right quality, and at the right level that was realistic for us, and aligned to the key positions we had to identify for each transfer window. So this was obviously quite a complicated process, but we were trying to be as efficient as possible and combine those subjective elements, because you need that inside knowledge from scouts on the personal qualities of players, to discuss with agents around potential transfer fees, contract situations, all the various pieces of information that either people within a certain country or within a certain circle of friends or relationships would know that are useful and helpful in being as efficient as possible. But I think the real challenge, identifying the players, was not necessarily the most difficult part of the process. I think there's a small pool of talent, and teams at the high end tend to look at similar players, and sometimes it's more a case of timing or the right player at the right time to progress your squad. But getting everyone aligned at that final stage to prioritize who your targets are was always the biggest challenge. I think that for me was where the SBG Match Tracker product has a real value to clubs in the Scouting and Recruitment domain, because I think it can combine such rich granular data sources that you can look at really specific scenarios and answer performance questions linked to video. And I think those are some of the key opportunities that are required when it gets to the nitty-gritty of deciding who to sign or who to prioritize. I think that's...
Hi, Donald.
Hi there,
Sorry,
Tom.
Donald. Tom here. We're running a tight ship, so I'm going to have to sadly jump in there. Okay. Unless you just had one more slide to go, but otherwise we'll jump to questions.
Yeah, I just had a couple final points. So what I'd say is, when you get to that point, the descent is more dangerous than the climb, and I think that's where the actual identifying the right player isn't essentially just the challenge. It's actually getting them to sign for your club, and then actually how they perform after that. And what I'd say is, I was just going to slightly introduce the fact that obviously I've started at Loughborough University to progress performance analysis and sports analytics, and we have a real kind of global vision for that. So we're keen for people to engage with us and discuss their performance problems and solutions across a number of sports. So please do reach out to me on Twitter or email after this, but obviously I'm open to any questions if you have any.
Cool. If you want to go back to that previous slide, I think it has both email and Twitter, and people can have a read of that while we just go through a couple of quick questions. So the first is from Sam Lawson, and Sam is asking, with recruitment being very data driven, and I assume this is based on your time at Norwich, have there been ways in which you've presented the data that has been most successful in sharing messages with coaches? Each coaching staff is different, but if there are any trends, especially those who want very data-driven, what have you found works and works well?
Well, I think that it's a really good question, Sam. Nice to hear from you again. So what we did a few different things because we wanted the data to be interactive. So we had apps that were easily accessible to get people to engage with it on a more regular basis, so that it became part of the norm. But what I'd say is we use things, and sometimes they can be a little bit misleading, so you've got to be careful and educate people on this. But we use things like radar charts just to try and visualize some of those data points. But we had simple things like formations for different competitions and different age categories. And we used a fairly sort of common, point of reference like the Premier League or the Football League Championship. Well, who are your favourite players or top 5 players in the league? So which ones do you like, and who do you think are the best players? And then match that up with what the data had identified as the key players on a football pitch with a scoring system out of 100 to make it really simple. And we had layers below that. But what it did is it showed a lot of overlap of, well, the things they look for in players and the players they rate were being highlighted by the data as well. The systems have been created to some extent independently, but they were identifying players. And then when we looked at leagues they weren't familiar with, when we demonstrated some of those players through the radar charts and in the video of the qualities, they were starting to buy into the fact that it was highlighting players with qualities they were interested in. So I think those are different ways we approach that to engage and then to actually get them to interact with the data.
Nice. So using a bit of confirmation bias there to essentially lead the horse to water in terms of targets which they've seen but maybe not fully focused on before.
Yeah, and I think that's where, performance sport isn't always purely scientific, but you're trying to use a process where you think it's as robust as possible in the kind of environment you're in. But yes, you're trying to get confidence in the process and then get them to engage with it regularly.
Cool. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Donald. I will say that Vignesh and Ben have both got a couple more questions in the Q&A chat. So once you get a second, it'd be fantastic if you could answer those, guys. Thanks again for your time. Great presentation. And I think for everyone, that was a really, really detailed and insightful look into essentially what a recruitment department is or should look like in 2020. And I think there's a ton of insights there that we can all take home. I'm especially intrigued by the player rating scores and kind of looking back and evaluating your own process, which I think that is something now that more and more clubs are starting to do. So Donald, again, thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom.